This is Tony Blazier for the Motocross Vault presented by Blinzall. If you're in the market for some high quality racing oil for your 2-stroke or 4, make sure you go to blinzall.com and use our discount code VAULT20 to save 20% at checkout. Thank you for all the support.
This is Hannah. This is Bailey.
This is Booters.
I thought you didn't want to torture her.
Welcome to the
Motocross Vault. I hope you like our intro.
Hello and welcome back to the Motocross Vault. My name is Tony Blazier, and what this video is going to cover is a look back at Suzuki's 1988 RM250. The late 80s were a bit of an up and down era for Suzuki. They had started out the decade really strong. The first full floaters were really successful machines, awesome bikes in like 81, 82. And then they really kind of stumbled there. The middle part of the decade was pretty tough. Honda really started coming on strong. And Suzuki's like 86 particularly was really bad. 87 and the 250 class at least, it got a lot better. And then in 88, they kind of broke through with a really good machine that actually won several shootouts this year. In spite of the fact that it still looked like an older bike. I mean, if you look at the 88, they added some new things, like they put a new tank on it, the shrouds, changed the look a little bit, but really the bike still looks a lot like an 83, 84 model. It's kind of old in the overall design. Even today, Suzuki seems to be hesitant to update the looks of the bike. They'll put an all new chassis, new engine and stuff in an RMZ250, and yet it still looks like the old one. It's just bizarre. I mean, the first bite's with the eyes, so I'm not quite sure why Suzuki seems so hesitant to do that, but this 88's a good example of that. The chassis was new. The engine was largely a carryover. A lot of the bodywork is actually changed, but it looks very similar to the old bike, and I think that probably hurt the perception of the bike in spite of the fact that it was very competitive. This bike was actually the most powerful in 250 and 88 in terms of like peak horsepower. Didn't have the broadest power. The Kawasaki KX250 was really the best motor that year. But the RM was fast, and that couldn't have been said 2 years earlier. In 86, they were anemic. 87 got a little better. In 88, they really kind of came on strong. They had a lot going for them this year. And in 89, they would finally come out with the all-new chassis, all-new bodywork, which really turned it from an ugly duckling into, in my opinion, one of the best-looking machines ever built. This 89 and 90 RMs were just phenomenal-looking motorcycles. And ironically, I think the 88 was probably a better bike than the 89. They made a lot of changes in 89. They went to a case reed motor and what have you that really didn't actually turn out to be a better performing machine than the 88, but it just looks so much better, and I think a lot of people probably bought it just on looks alone, in spite of the fact that the 88 was probably a better machine. Now, if you like Suzuki's and you want to check out some of the other stuff I've done a lot of other RMs on the channel, RM125s, RM250s, and what have you. I also have a history of the complete RMX. I also did a history of the PE175, one of my favorite little enduro machines from the late 70s and early 80s. So if you like off-road content, whether it be motorcycles, motocross, ATV, whatever, if you check out some of the other videos on the channel, I have a lot of other different things to offer there. I'm very agnostic in terms of off-road coverage, so I kind of cover it all a little bit. If you like to support what I do, I have Motocross Vault merch available. Same kind of deal. I have Suzuki stuff available. I've done a history of the Suzuki's, kind of showing a lot of their iconic models, and that's available like in a poster, a sticker, t-shirt, sweatshirts, and what have you. You can find all that stuff in my Teespring store. I've done several RM models, including I believe an 88 RM80, kind of a Buddy Anthony tribute, and a bunch of other different designs. But if you are interested in supporting what I do, I will put a link in this description below and a card here in the video to my Spring store. So here is the story of the 1988 Suzuki RM250. The 1980s were an interesting time for Suzuki. In most respects, the little manufacturer from Hamamatsu had dominated motocross racing throughout the 70s. Their factory motocross team had taken countless world motocross titles, and their production RMs were widely acknowledged to be the best production machines available. As the 80s began, Team Suzuki was on top. In the early part of the decade, Suzuki was able to continue that momentum with innovations like the remarkable full floater rear suspension system. The suspension on these early 80s RMs was night and day better than the competition, and more than enough to solidify their position as the leader in motocross technology. With stars like George Jobet, Kent Howerton, Mark Barnett, and Eric Gabors on their machines, and the best suspension on the track, Suzuki was poised to create a motocross dynasty. As the decade went on, however, cracks began to show in Suzuki's dominant motocross program. After floundering with their early 80s efforts, Honda began to turn around its production bike program with greatly improved machines. These DeCoster-designed CRs quickly transformed Honda from an also-ran into the industry leader, and by 1983, Big Red, was pushing Suzuki out of the limelight in all three big bike classes. In 1984, Suzuki released all new machines in the 125 and 250 divisions, but both failed to recapture the glory of their previous efforts. The new RM125 was still well suspended, but its anemic motor was no match for the powerhouse KX and do-it-all CR. In the 250 class, the class-leading power of the 82 RM was a distant memory. The 84 RM250 offered improvements in several areas, but it lacked the ponies to keep up with Honda's blazing fast CR250. In the open class, the RM500 was practically a relic with its 1981-era chassis and bodywork. It was well suspended and good handling, but badly underpowered compared to its newer rivals. For the Suzuki faithful of the time, this fall from grace was a difficult pill to swallow. After over a decade of dominance, the Yellow Squad was left playing catch-up in every division. After two more disappointing years in 1985 and 1986, Suzuki finally started to turn around their 250 program with an all-new RM in 1987. The 87 RM250 was not the world beater the 82 model had been, but it was by far the most competitive machine Suzuki had built in half a decade. The all-new motor and redesigned full floater brought the RM250 back from the brink of irrelevance to a respectable position near the front. With the best suspension in the class and a snappy power plant, the RM was finally a legitimate contender once again. For 1988, Suzuki looked to build on the success they had enjoyed with the 87 RM while addressing a few of the issues that had held it back the year before. For most riders, that list of improvements needed to start with a redesign of the RM's pilot compartment. In 1987, the RM had looked and felt like a 4-year-old machine. Its ergonomics were the worst in the class, and its high-mounted radiators gave the bike a top-heavy feel that hindered its nimbleness in the turns. For 1988, Suzuki redesigned the tank and repositioned the radiators to make sliding forward easier. A new seat was also added, which was lower and longer, and afforded the RM a feel more in line with the new Honda and Yamaha machines. In addition to allowing better rider movement, the new layout also lowered the radiators a full 2 inches on the frame for better weight distribution. On the motor front, Suzuki chose to focus on refinement to their 246cc two-stroke mill. All new in 1987, the RM's redesigned engine had been a major improvement over the anemic 86 version. It was snappy and fun to ride, but not as outright powerful as Honda's CR250. For 1988, Suzuki looked to boost performance by altering the port timing and massaging the power valve to improve exhaust port sealing. A new expansion chamber was added to match the redesigned porting specs and pair with a larger and quieter alloy silencer. Feeding fuel to the mill was an all-new 38mm Mikuni slingshot carburetor that Suzuki promised would provide greater throttle response and an end to the 87 model's annoying stalling issues. Finally, Suzuki beefed up the drivetrain to handle the additional power by adding 2 additional plates to the clutch and strengthening the detents between gears to prevent missed shifts and provide a more positive feel. On the track, the 88 RM250 proved to be by far the most competitive Suzuki power package in half a decade. Not since the glory years of the early 80s had the yellow machine stood any real chance of besting its 250 rivals in any serious contest of acceleration. Unlike the tractor-like KX and smooth as silk CR, the 88 RM provided a snappy and quick revving delivery that rocketed out of turns and blasted into the mid-range. At peak, it pumped out 40.6 horsepower on Dirt Rider's dyno, which put it at the very top of the 88 250 standings. Once on the pipe, the RM was as fast as anything in the class, but its power band was not as broad as some of its rivals. It was less torquey than the KX or YZ, and not as long-pulling as the Rev It to the Moon Honda. As in 1987, it did its best work in the mid-range, with a bit more down low and a slight bump in power on top. In the mid-range, the 88 motor pumped out an eye-opening 6 more horsepower than 1987. That was the kind of increase you could really feel on the track, and the RM took a step back to no one when it was in the meat of its power curve. The new Mikuni carburetor also offered much better throttle response than 87, so even though the RM did not pack the grunt of the YZ or KX, it did feel appreciably more robust than the year before. With its powerful mid-range and quick-building power, the 88 RM was a lot of fun to ride. While it was not as broad or easy to control as some of its rivals, the 88 RM did pack the power needed to compete at the front. Alongside the improved throttle response, the biggest improvements to the RM's power package for 88 was its redesigned clutch and transmission. In 1987, the RM had been notoriously easy to knock out of gear. The slightest nudge of the shifter was often enough to slip the machine into a false neutral, with potentially disastrous results. For 1988, the beefed-up clutch and upgraded transmission offered a much more positive feel, and the bike no longer tried to jump out of gear if you sneezed on the shifter. It did lack the rock-solid precision of the Honda's transmission, but it was easily the second-best cog box of 1988. While the motor was fast and fun, the true star of the Suzuki package for 1988 was its awesome suspension. In the early 80s, the yellow machines had owned the suspension category with their remarkable full floater suspension system. Its complex arrangement of links and levers was unparalleled at smoothing out the bumps, but it was complicated to manufacture, expensive to produce, and embroiled in some very unsavory legal wrangling involving the origins of its design. Due to these many factors, Suzuki retired the original full floater in 1986 and introduced an all-new version that replaced the levers and pull rods in use since 1981 with a new eccentric cam linkage below the shock. While this new design was lighter, more compact, and offered much better weight distribution, it also failed to match the performance of its predecessor. Plagued with stiction issues that drug down its performance, the new non-floating full floater knocked Suzuki from the top of the heap to the bottom of the pile in the 86 suspension standings. After the debacle of 1986, Hamamatsu went back to the drawing board for 1987 and introduced an all-new rear linkage design. The reimagined full floater retired the problematic eccentric cam of 1986 in favor of a more conventional bottom link design. By 1987, all the manufacturers had settled on some version of Honda's original Pro Link as the ideal arrangement for a single-shock linkage suspension. In spite of the fact that the RM's new Honda clone linkage no longer held the shock in a quote-unquote floating position, Suzuki continued to use the full floater name for several more years. Floating or not, the new design proved a huge improvement over the poorly thought-out 1986 version. For 1988, Suzuki kept the 87 design but revised the ratio slightly in the linkage to provide a more progressive action. In addition to the new ratio, Suzuki also spec'd an all-new hard anodized piggyback reservoir KYB shock that featured new dual-stage valving and a slightly stiffer spring. On the track, the 88 full floater performed nearly flawlessly. It was plush and well controlled over obstacles big and small, with excellent feel and good bottoming resistance. It was by far the best rear end of 1988, with only Yamaha's redesigned YZ250 coming close to matching its silky smooth performance. Even for fast riders, the ultra plush Suzuki was the hot ticket in 1988. In the front, the RM's 43mm Kiaba cartridge forks also were the best performing units available at the time. They offered adjustments for both compression and rebound damping, a feature missing on Honda's Showa forks in 1988. In stock condition, they were a little softly sprung for faster or heavier riders, but with an upgrade in springs, they were near perfection. Small chop and big hits were taken without a whimper, and their smooth action was praised by everyone from novice to pro. In 1987, one of the major factors holding back the RM250 had been its handling. The 87 version offered a very pedestrian handling package that felt top-heavy in the corners and inaccurate at speed. There was a loose and flexy feel to the chassis that made it difficult to trust, and nearly everyone hated the cramped and old-fashioned layout of its chassis. The tall tank, highly placed radiators, and awkward ergonomics made properly weighting the front wheel difficult, and the RM's cornering accuracy suffered for it. For 1988, Suzuki looked to improve the RM's handling by adjusting the geometry, improving the ergonomics, and adding some much-needed bracing to the frame. The new frame maintained the 87's chromoly steel construction and oval tubing, but added additional materials to the steering stem to fight flex. They also moved the swing arm pivot forward slightly and repositioned the radiators to sit lower on the frame. The steering head was moved out 10mm and up 1mm, and the rake was pulled in 1 degree to improve steering precision. The main frame backbone was also reshaped to be straighter and more resistant to flex under heavy loads. Lastly, a new headstay was added to tie the chassis together and increase rigidity. For most riders, the most notable change on the RM's feel was its new ergonomics. The new lowered tank, repositioned radiators, and flatter saddle made sliding fore and aft much easier, and the overall feel of the machine was roomier for 1988. Getting forward in turns was no longer a chore, and this paid major dividends in the RM's turning precision. The new geometry, stiffer chassis, and revised ergonomics gave the Suzuki a much more modern feel, and the RM exhibited far better turning manners than in the past. There was still a bit of a push on hardpack, and the bike was in no danger of carving underneath a CR, but in most respects it was a solid improvement. At speed, however, the RM was less successful, and it retained some of the wayward feel riders had disliked the year before. When you got it into the upper gears, the Suzuki felt unplanted in spite of its excellent suspension, and big hits still produced a noticeable flex from the chassis. This resulted in a bit of unpredictability when attacking serious whoops at speed. Sometimes the RM gobbled them up, and sometimes the chassis took a violent swap to the left or right. This was not ideal for stadium whoops or high-speed desert work, but most riders who did not push the RM's chassis to its limits did not have an issue. There was also a bit of the Honda's headshake under deceleration, but it was far less pronounced than on the Red machine. Overall, the 88 RM250 was a decent handler that did most things well, but nothing spectacularly. In the details department, the RM was a couple of steps behind the best bikes in the class in 1988. In spite of its new layout, the bike looked like a 5-year-old machine. The odd duckbill platypus front fender and ill-fitting plastic spoke to an era long gone by 1988. By not updating the bodywork, Suzuki made the machine look far older than it really was. On the positive side were new brakes, which greatly improved the RM's stopping ability, but it did remain a bit behind the class-leading Honda in terms of overall power and feel. It also lacked a fully removable subframe, which the CR had had since 1983. Overall fastener quality was also of the utter garbage variety, and the RM used a maddening assortment of sizes and types that seemed to defy any sort of logic. If you were going to take your RM apart, it was best to bring a full toolbox and a ton of spares to replace the soon-to-be-stripped OEM junk. The stock grips were also mediocre at best, and because they were vulcanized on, changing them was an utter nightmare that involved literally cutting them off piece by piece. At least most people liked the feel of the levers, although they were far less resistant to crash damage than the tough forged units found on the Honda. In 1988, Suzuki took a major step forward with their motocross program. After half a decade of miserable failures, the RM came roaring back with a highly competitive motocross package. In spite of its stale appearance, the 88 RM offered the kind of winning performance that riders were looking for in the 250 division. Its powerful motor could run with anybody, and its Ultra Plus suspension was the best in the field. It still looked like a loser, but under that moldy oldie appearance beat the heart of a winner. So there you have it. That's a look back at the history of the 1988 RM250. Really one of the best RMs for another more than half a decade, probably till 1996. 89 again, I love that design. It was a really cool looking motorcycle. A buddy of mine bought one of those things, and I was not a super fan of the 89. It was just weird. It felt like it had a hinge in the middle, to me at least. I believe I was riding Hondas at the time. Anyway, it just had a strange feel to it. Another buddy of mine had an 87 RM, although I've never ridden an 88. I really liked his 87. It was pretty nice in a lot of ways. The motor wasn't super fast, but it was a fun to ride bike. And the 89, man, it put me on my head several times. It would just, you come into a turn and it would like knife oversteer, and it just kind of a bike that I think maybe you had to ride all the time to feel comfortable on. The motor was very narrow, a case reed engine, in terms of the power band, not the actual size. Just had a very peaky kind of a mid-range only engine. It was kind of hard to ride, for me at least. At the time, my CR offered a much wider power band, and I'd get on that RM and be like, how do you ride this thing? Suzuki, they've had a lot of ups and downs over the years. The early 80s and the 70s certainly was probably their heyday. They had some great machines. And in the 90s, they had several good machines as well. I had a 96 RM. I love that. And there were some really good bikes in the later 90s. This 88, though, is probably the best machine, at least since 82. It was a really good bike. And I don't know that maybe it got as much attention as it probably should have because it looked so old-fashioned. It really looked like an old bike. If you look at the 88 CR250 and how sexy and beautiful it looks, and you look at the 88 RM and it looks like like a retreaded 84 model. Which one are you going to choose? In spite of the fact that the 88 RM was a better bike in pretty much every way, except maybe build quality. That's one of those bikes I think that kind of goes down in history and doesn't really get a fair shake because it looks like such a retread in spite of the fact that it was a much better machine in pretty much every way. So if you like this sort of thing, make sure you check out some of the stuff on the channel. If you could like, subscribe, and share on social media, leave a comment below. I really would appreciate it. It helps people discover the channel. And I know that I read all the comments. I love all the great comments everybody gives me. I certainly appreciate all your support out there. So until we meet again, this is Tony Blazier from Motocross Vault. Keep the rubber side down. Peace.